Go.
Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe and wearing masks, and I hope reading many biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby in particular for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. It is her vision that has made this program possible. Please note that our next events are later this month. On February 23rd, Hillary Holiday will be discussing her biography of Adrienne Rich with Francesca Wade, one of our current Leon Levy Biography Fellows. And then the very next evening, on February 24th, again at 6 p.m., we will host veteran foreign affairs correspondent Elizabeth Becker. She will be in conversation with Ann Nelson to discuss You Don't Belong Here, How Three Women Rewrote the Story of War. This is a fascinating group biography of three women reporters who covered the Vietnam War. But tonight we are here to celebrate Tamara Payne and her late father Les Payne for their magnificent biography, The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X. Please look for this book online at bookshops.org, a site that leads you to your local independent bookstore. Tamara Payne will be in conversation this evening with her editor, Robert Weil, the highly regarded editor-in-chief of Liveright Publishing, a division of W.W. Norton. All biography is an arduous journey, in my experience, but this project has an especially long backstory. Les Payne was born in 1941 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He became a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and editor at Newsday. But back in 1990, he began interviewing anyone he could find who had known Malcolm X. The years rolled by, and eventually his daughter, Tamara, became his primary researcher. Les Payne died in 2018, and Tamara completed the biography. The result is a stunning achievement, a riveting page-turner of a biography. Tamara and Robert will have a conversation for about 40 minutes and then take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and Robert will be sure to get to as many as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Tamara Payne, congratulations on this formidable achievement. And Robert, I now turn the rest of this evening's event over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kai, and thank you to the Leon Levy Biography Center. It's a real joy to be here as the editor of The Dead Are Arising, but this is Tammy Payne, Tamara Payne. Tammy, is this the first event we've done on this book? Is this the first event we've done?
Yes, Bob, this is the first one.
So it's particularly joyous to, do something with a wonderful author. Tammy and the late Les Payne won the National Book Award in November for nonfiction. Subsequently, they're a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. And just this evening, we learned that, Tammy, your book is a finalist for the NAACP Award for Biography, which is an extremely prestigious award. So I want to congratulate you.
Thank you. That is indeed an honor. It really is.
Well, that's a great award.
Yes.
You would know that you know the history of this book extremely well. Why did your father 31 years ago choose to do a biography of Malcolm X?
That's a very good question, Bob. And a little bit more than 31 years ago, Dad didn't even think we needed a book on Malcolm, a biography of Malcolm, because he had read autobiography. He thought that gave us a lot of information about Malcolm and the story that Malcolm tells about himself. And we also have his speeches. And my father is a huge admirer of Malcolm X, and would read the autobiography every year, and would even play Malcolm's speeches, for me growing up in the home. So my mom and I would listen to it over the years, and eventually my brothers also, listened to them. But so my father definitely admired Malcolm, and he felt that we had everything we needed to know until he happened to he was with his friend Walter Evans in Detroit, and he met one of Malcolm's brothers, and that was exciting in itself. And Dad, being a journalist, he was curious, and he's always looking for a story. As a journalist, he never stopped looking for what's new and interesting, and what does the story tell. And so he took the opportunity to interview this brother, and he learned a lot. And he came back to New York and was discussing with another colleague of his, Gil Noble, who's also a journalist and also an admirer of Malcolm X. And Gil Noble asked my father, which brother did you speak to? And my father said Filbert. And Gil Noble said, the brother you should speak to is Wilfred. So Dad goes back to Detroit and meets Wilfred, and Wilfred agrees to sit down for an interview. And after 8 hours, Dad comes back, and he's just processing the stories that he's learned from these two brothers of Malcolm, growing up, what Malcolm was like during his lifetime as a child, learning about the family, what it was like in the household of Earl and Louise Little. And so Dad came away and just said, we don't know this side of Malcolm. We don't know this about him, and we should know. People should learn this and understand who Malcolm was as a child. For example, that Louise and Earl Little met at a meeting of Marcus Garvey's group, the UNIA in Montreal, and they were followers of Marcus Garvey, and they carried that on, and they worked for the organization and moved out to the Midwest to organize for Marcus Garvey. And how did that affect the children in the household? So Dad felt that this was really important to learn, because now this gives us even more information about our history, the importance of Malcolm, but also the importance of Marcus Garvey on Malcolm and his family.
Quick question, Tammy.
Yes.
When your dad originally met Filbert, who was much younger than Wilfred, was someone trying to set your dad up to get him to do a biography? Because he had already won a Pulitzer Prize. Was it intentional, or was it just it happened to be a meeting and then it snowballed from there?
My understanding is that Filbert had been talking about wanting to do his own book, and and Dad had heard that, and he listened to the story, and he said, Dad has to be able to write the story. He's not going to just write a story that the person wants you to tell. He's not going to do what Alex Haley did in the case of Malcolm X, for example. He's going to want to dig more and tell, more of the story, and probably the story that Filbert didn't really want to tell. So it didn't work out that way.
Tammy, let me put something in context, and I want you to elaborate on it after I give these dates to the group here, just to reflect how extraordinary, and I'd say historic, your dad's interviews were. He decided, say about 30 years ago, he wanted to interview anyone who was significant in Malcolm X's life. So he interviewed Filbert, who then died in 1993, and he had already interviewed him. He interviewed Malcolm's half-sister, Ella Little Collins, who died in 1996. Wilfred died in 1998. And you can almost go on through this entire set of characters. For Yuri Kochiyama, the Japanese-American radical who cradles Malcolm in her arms, when he's dying at the end. She died in 2014. So you're just amazed that your dad got to all these people. It often seems shortly before they died.
Well, I wouldn't say it was shortly before they died. I mean, I think what was happening is when we started working on this was almost 27 years after Malcolm had passed away. So he was assassinated. So let's say in 90, and he died in 1965. 75, 85. Yeah, this is coming on 30 years, 25, 30 years after Malcolm had passed away. So when Malcolm is assassinated in 1965, the climate is hot. So a lot of people who knew Malcolm, they had to pick up their lives and figure things out. And times are still hot with what was going on in the struggle here in New York and elsewhere in the country. So, they weren't necessarily talking about Malcolm per se, but trying to move on with their lives. Now, later on, when we're coming in, Malcolm's, being kind of brought back into the pop culture we knew that the movie was being filmed at the time. We also know that younger people were reading Malcolm, but I would also say that people were reading Malcolm even after, right around the time he died. He never leaves a conversation, but he's coming back up in the media visually and audio and through music. And then people are, there's time has passed and the environment has changed. And so people are kind of opening up too.
See, it's my belief that had he not gotten to many of these people, we wouldn't know what happened. And I'll give you, I know you want to say something.
No, but go ahead.
No, you want a few anecdotes of me working with your father. I signed him up in 2014 through the amazing literary agent Faith Childs, who just felt that I would get along with Les, and indeed we did. But I remember starting to work on this book, and I didn't have the footnotes. And I start seeing all these things in quotes. I mean, you just open it up, and there's a description of Louise pregnant with the Klan coming to their door. And there are all these quotes and descriptions, whatever. And I said, well, how did you get this, Les? He said, oh, Wilfred told me that, very nonchalantly. Oh, I said, okay. And no, Filbert told me this like when I met him here. And I was because I felt I was just suddenly, I thought he got these from someone else. And as I sort of got through the chapters of the book, I was just stunned that so many of the quotes were firsthand from this extraordinary researcher. So that's...
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said, when Dad is starting to do these interviews, particularly starting with the brothers, and he's realizing that there's a story here, then he sets into his journalism motive of getting to as many people as he can. He's not thinking about whether or not they're dying off, but he wants to talk to as many people as he can. And we're talking, and we're telling people, because I was brought on early on to help out with this. And when we meet people, we're saying we're interested in finding who knew Malcolm, what was their friendship like, what was the relationship like. We're writing this book. My father would say, I'm working on a book on the life of Malcolm X. And, and we were pretty upfront about that and just telling people we weren't thinking about that this is, the last chance of getting it. It turned into that. But I would also argue that other people are also talking to a lot of these people because people were also going on lecture circuits. There were people sitting on panels talking about Malcolm over these years. So people were talking to them and interviewing. They didn't have the platform that Dad could command, but there were people who were writing papers, for example, and research papers for colleges and university degrees and interviewing these people. So we weren't the only ones out there. We were doing what we were doing though.
But you've been, I might add, very gracious in praising a lot of other works as also being significant. So you're absolutely right about that. In terms of Malcolm's position in our culture today, would you say he's at the same level that he was in 1990 when your dad began? Is he more significant? Can you make an assessment of how much he means to the culture in 1990 versus today?
What I will say is that every time a book comes out about Malcolm X, people gravitate to it and they talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So he's never left the stage. There is an interest into it,
I mean, in listening to some of the social protest movements of last year, I felt directly connected to so much of what Malcolm had said, far more, say, than Martin Luther King. If anything, I found he's very relevant in many ways. You mentioned
Malcolm is, we're talking about Malcolm, and Malcolm is very relevant. And I explained to a lot of people that the way Malcolm was very.
we're experiencing a little. Are you there?
Sure what's going on there? Malcolm, what's going on? Yeah, I'm not hearing you. I don't know if you heard me.
We heard
I
you.
did hear you. You're a little delayed. Can you hear me now?
As are you for me. I hear you, but there seems to be a delay going on.
I will pause after I ask a question. I think we'll make it.
Okay. I'm not sure where we're going with this.
Okay, let me ask you a new question. You mentioned very early on, as we began discussing how Malcolm Little met Louise in Montreal, and you mentioned Marcus Garvey. Could you tell our listeners and what people will discover about Marcus Garvey in the biography and why he's so significant to this story?
Yeah, it was Earl. Malcolm wasn't born yet. It was Earl and Louise met in Montreal at a meeting for the UNIA, and they were followers of Marcus Garvey and his movement of it was for Black people who were trying to survive in a culture, in American culture in particular, but other cultures around the world, because Marcus Garvey himself came from Jamaica, to survive in a world that was really kind of set against Black people and Black success. And Marcus Garvey was encouraging people to embrace who they were as Black people, to build their own businesses, support their businesses, and to be independent and independent minded. And so Louise was drawn to this. Earl Little was also drawn to this. He was living in Jim Crow South, and he wasn't faring well there. In fact, his father had asked him to leave because of his pride was bringing too much attention from white people who were having a problem with, who don't like to deal with proud Black people, and usually like to make examples of them by lynching them and doing other atrocious things to them. So his family was encouraging him to, go up north and find a new way, find his way, and he did. And so they met, and they met through Marcus Garvey, and they were working with Marcus Garvey because they were thriving under, in this organization. And they moved out to the Midwest, starting with Omaha, Nebraska, and we're having children and building up their family, but also organizing families wherever they move to. But what we also find through doing the research on and learning about not just Earl and Louise Little's work in the organization, but that other people were also impacted by Marcus Garvey's movement, such as Elijah Muhammad, even Ella, who's Malcolm's half sister back in Georgia. So they were also impacted. We also find that the tenets of Marcus Garvey's movement is also found in the in Moore Science Temple, and in that organization, and it also, as well as in the Nation of Islam, which later on is what attracts Wilfred, Malcolm's oldest brother, to that organization, and also to bring his siblings in there. So Marcus Garvey, this is really important. So a lot of things kind of grow out and are, I would say, even continue to grow out of that movement. And there are other movements that grew out of that. So it's very expansive, and it helped a lot of people to survive.
All right, that's very helpful. For people who haven't read the book, I find the opening with Louise Little being pregnant. Amazing. I think it has sadly more relevance to today than some people might think, but just for the reader, can you tell it's just extraordinary, the prose, but can you tell the reader what is going on there just so they know what they will encounter at the beginning of the book?
Well, I think it's important that we open the book with we have the Klan visiting the Little family in Omaha, Nebraska, and it sets the scene as to what this book is going to be about. We say it's called The Dead Are Rising Life of Malcolm X, but we also you have Malcolm's family, his mother. His father is away organizing. He has his brothers, Filbert and Wilfred. Wilfred's the one who tells the story to my father and gives us such details about the horsemen and the horses that the Klansmen are riding. And, and then the feeling, the emotions that he experiences with his mother in this confrontation. And so anyway, they're living in Omaha, Nebraska. The Littles family is organizing, doing their work for the Marcus Garvey movement. And white people, they're not happy with this. And the Klansmen are, doing what they do and trying to keep Black people in check. And they tell the Littles to leave town. And what's important to also understand is that this sets the scene for the world. This is literally the world that Malcolm was born into. Malcolm is Louise is pregnant with Malcolm, as you said. This sets the scene. This is the world Malcolm's born into, and we're also going to explore who Malcolm is. But it's important because we're putting Malcolm in American history and where he is in history and how these events have impacted and forced the family to make certain choices and how history works that way with
Tammy,
a lot of us. We later, go ahead.
That is fantastic because what I see as one of the real virtues of this book is that time and time again, you and your dad set Malcolm's life, as you just said, against American history. It's just not Malcolm acting in a vacuum. There's direct relation to the stock market crash of 1929, to the Depression and Louise's inability to feed her family. You can even talk about the draft of, Malcolm being drafted, etc. But time and time again, there are these two stories which come together. And if you could just give us a little example of
that. Well, starting with the opening of the book of putting him in the context, but even if we look at what happened in 1931 when Earl Little dies. He dies in a streetcar accident. But again, it's the atmosphere. Before Earl Little dies, the family was living on land that had an exclusionary clause in the deed where Black people weren't supposed to own it. And the white neighbors this is in Lansing, and the white neighbors in Lansing moved to have the Little family evicted from this property. And so again, the atmosphere of dealing with a proud Black family. And so they moved to have him evicted and they succeed. But before they fully can leave the land, before they move off the land, somebody burns the house down. So this happens before Earl Little, dies, but it happens not long before he dies. And then after he dies, there's talk by other people who want to take responsibility and say that they had a hand in the killing of Earl Little. But we found through our work that Earl Little died in a streetcar accident. We compared this with the coroner report. We listened to what Wilfred, who was 12 years old when this happened, and he was there when the police comes in. But what I really want to talk about again about the environment, these are things that the family did, but the environment is that this is in 1931 when this happens, and the stock market has crashed. They're in the Depression, and everybody's struggling. And now we're going to see how this family struggles during this time, but everybody's struggling at this time.
Can you tell us the story of what the insurance company does? Because it's one of the most wrenching stories in the book.
It is so heart-wrenching because, Earl took pride in having insurance that was supposed to be a protection for his family should anything horrible happen. And he did not commit suicide. He had two policies, and one of the larger policy, the company said that they would not pay because they decided that Earl did not die in an accident. He died because he killed himself. And so they didn't have to pay it out. And it was horrible. And the family really could have used that money, and they had to, and that just impacted them more. It wasn't a choice that they had to make. It was forced on them. And that makes it even harder for how are they going to make ends meet, even though they were trying to have a security blanket to help them during a time of need.
They also knew that a struggling Black widow would not be able to come after the insurance companies, that she had no method to sue or claim her money. And they were very willful in that, and you show that beautifully. I have in my questions here, and I'll tell you I wanted to ask you what your favorite character is. Mine often is the Mother Louise, struggling to make dandelion soup, and she's institutionalized because the poverty is so oppressive, and she's an amazing character in the book. Who are some of can you even say who some of your favorite characters are?
There are many.
Yeah.
Because not only are they for the readers, they're characters. Basically, they don't get to know them. I actually got to meet some of these people. Like, one of the people I was very impressed with meeting was John Davis Jr., who was hanging out with Malcolm during the time after Malcolm's father had died, and Malcolm.
Tell us who he is. Who is?
I'm telling you who he is. Malcolm turns around 12 years old. He's starting to drop out of school, and he runs into this guy, John Davis Jr., who's 4 years older than him. And they start hanging out together, and Malcolm's cutting school. But the story of John Davis is interesting because he's from Mississippi, and he himself was escaping, a situation in which he could have been lynched. And his family smuggled him out of Mississippi and sent him up north. And so he's staying with family. But he and Malcolm are kind of hanging out and smoking pot. Malcolm is selling pot and kind of getting into, trouble. And he tells us these interesting things about Malcolm's personality. He says that Malcolm's highly intelligent, had a photographic memory. And it's just kind of hearing these details of that age from him. And I just really, but he himself was an impressive person to me. Another person that I also enjoyed meeting and speaking with was Vicky Garvin, who Malcolm met in Ghana. And she herself worked in labor unions here in New York before she went off to work in Ghana as an expatriate and helping Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah after it had been liberated from their colonizers. So she and a group of other Black Americans, such as the Doctors Lees, who were classmates of Kwame Nkrumah, set up, were living as expatriates in Ghana to build up the new Ghana, and listening to her stories of living in Ghana, but also that she had seen Malcolm different phases of his life. She saw him when he was hustling in Harlem. She saw him also when he was when he was a minister for the Harlem Temple and preaching on 125th Street. But then she also gets to see him come to Ghana and see him traveling and he's expanding his mind. So she sees him different key points of his life, and just hearing her stories on that, as well as she was an interesting person in her own right.
Because
let me also say Yuri Kuchiyama, who I've got to know very well, who was just a wonderful person and very generous in getting to know her, but also in getting to know other people who knew Malcolm. She introduced me to a lot of people who became members of the OAAU and who also knew Malcolm in other phases of his life. So Yuri Kuchiyama also is somebody. She's one of my favorites.
Because of the manuscript, I really studied up who she was. And she just died around 2014 or 15. And she was in the Audubon ballroom, when Malcolm dies. And you met her.
Yes, she was there the day of the assassination. And I actually set up the interview to interview her. And my father and I went over to her home in Harlem, and we interviewed her and her husband, Bill Kuchiyama, who was there. And, she and I just really hit it off, and, we became friends, and she had a lot of respect for my father also, but she and I really just hit it off and became really, really close friends. And I just, I just really admired, who she was living, she Japanese American woman who wanted to live in Harlem from the 60s on, and raised her children and grandchildren who were very close to her. Akemi Kuchiyama's, is up and coming. And so, I mean, I really got close to her and her family, and she was just an amazing person. To listen to her stories of Malcolm, she highly appreciated who Malcolm was, and she respected him, even on the parts of Malcolm where she disagreed with him. But she gave him that space that they disagreed on. But she really appreciated when he was, because Yuri was also very much about building bridges between cultures. And so
what is amazing about that is there's not huge amount of time spent on the book on her, but it's done so well in such a, like, several pages, and she's such a memorable character. There are two chapters that I feel we should let the listeners know about before we go to the question and answers. And I'm thinking the first one is Hartford, and the other one will be the modern Klan chapter. But with Hartford, it's I think it's chapter 13, is it? No, yes, it's chapter 13. And it's the chapter The Dead Are Rising. It will allow you to explain what the meaning of that title is. But everyone says, why Hartford? Why is Hartford so significant to the story? But it's a double meaning of both Malcolm and your father. And I'm wondering if you could tell us as listeners why Hartford just comes alive in 1955 with such incredible poignance and immediacy.
My father was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and his family moved up to Hartford when he was 12 years old. So he grew up from age 12 and went to college at University of Connecticut Stores. So he grew up in Hartford. And so it was very important. But what was really interesting is we knew, Dad, as I said, Dad would read the autobiography every year, and he knew that, Hartford was on the radar of Malcolm, but he didn't know how important it was. Like, he didn't really fully understand, what that was about. But this book, and working on this book, it gave him the opportunity to explore that. And that's the other thing. It's like, when you're being a journalist and doing research on this story, you kind of go where the facts take you. And one of the things he thought about was, like, I grew up in Hartford. I know Hartford. And Hartford's not really discussed when it comes to Malcolm. And he says it'll be interesting to find out what Malcolm was like in Hartford. So the Hartford chapter, I really enjoy the Hartford chapter because of the family ties. One, that my father grew up there, my grandparents were there, I still have relatives there, but also in finding some of the people we knew. For example, Eddie St. John, who was one of the founding members of the Hartford Temple, and it was his mother-in-law that invited Malcolm, Rosalie Bay Glover, who invited Malcolm to speak to them in Hartford in her apartment. But it was Eddie St. John who actually worked with my uncle, who's my father's brother. They worked together for many years at the post office. So I enjoyed, just kind of exploring those connections that we have with the family, and also the town. I mean, Hartford was a town that, I would often, it was like a second home to me growing up. But the other thing about Hartford is that Malcolm has received permission to organize this temple at the request, of Rosalie Bay Glover and other people who are interested in the Nation of Islam. They were Christians, and they were disillusioned with Christianity, and they were looking for other ways of expressing their religion, but and wanting to, be, looking for these tenets of being self-reliant, embracing who they are as Black people, and building their own businesses and having that community support and building that. And they found that they first went to the Moorish Science Temple, but then they found it really for them in Nation of Islam when they would see Malcolm speak in local meetings, like in Springfield. So what the book's title coming out of Hartford is important because, Malcolm would write about his progress in Hartford in recruiting people and building this temple. And he did come across obstacles because Hartford really was a Martin Luther King town. The Black community is very strong Christians, and they liked Martin Luther King. They kind of viewed Malcolm as, he was very aggressive, and they thought that he was going to have everybody become radical and kill people. And that was some of the thoughts. But then there are people who understood that that's not what he was trying to do. And so Malcolm was writing to Elijah Muhammad about his progress in this work. And he wrote to him and said, we're confronting obstacles, but we also have success, and the dead there are rising. And that line is what it appealed to Dad. It clicked for Dad to title this book, The Dead Are Rising. And what it refers to is when in the Nation of Islam, before you're in a nation, people outside are considered dead. And when you join, you're embracing your true self and accepting the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. But also, it becomes a metaphor, not just only for the book of coming into embracing who you truly are, but learning the truth about who Malcolm is, learning the truth about what's been going on in this country for so long, and that we're even now confronting this. So the Dead Are Rising, I would even say, is a metaphor for what's happening with us today in America or in the world.
I would totally agree. I want to go to the other two in a minute, but I was rereading the Hartford chapter this afternoon. And if any reader wants to understand the appeal of Malcolm, the Nation of Islam, on
Absolutely.
an individual level, it crackles with authenticity and drama in a way which just stuns you. And it's really the formation of a temple, but the individuals are just brought alive with such immediacy. Can we go to that other chapter?
It really gives Dad a chance to write intimately about, Hartford, because he knows it. And so he kind of brings himself intimately in an indirect way through his writing of, the locations and what the people were like, and kind of understanding the attitudes. And it just comes off the page, and it is some wonderful writing of the book.
We totally agree. It's hard to choose your favorite chapters because the whole book reads like an epic, but a lot of people comment on this. You'd almost think you're reading science fiction or something. It's set in 1961, and it is this chapter called Meet with Them Devils. And can you tell the listeners just the unlikelihood of it, and it's something out of a movie. What is Meet with Them Devils about?
I also like to point out, you said that the Hartford chapter is chapter 13. It was actually Hartford chapter is chapter 12, and this chapter is chapter 13,
Correct.
Which is kind of ironic, right? But yes, the Klan chapter, as we call it, it's enlightening. And it is a great example of journalism when you think about, there have been mentions. Malcolm mentioned that this meeting happened, a week before he dies. People have heard rumblings about this and talked about it, but we never knew the details of this. Other people have said that we probably won't ever know the details of this. And Dad, through journalism, through sourcing and talking with, and we get this from Jeremiah X, who's the minister of the Atlanta temple at that time. He's the one that tells us this story, and it is riveting with details of what actually happened. But just to set it up, it's Malcolm's visiting the temple. He's actually the Northeast representative for the Nation of Islam. So he's visiting the South, and he doesn't do it often. And he's speaking at the temple. And while he's speaking, they being the nation, receives a telegram from the local Klan chapters requesting a meeting. And and Malcolm doesn't hear about this until after he finishes, and he's kind of excited because to meet with the Klan. But Malcolm's excitement is really about, wow, we could have a face-off and really tell them, put them in their place. He wants to have a confrontation with the Klan. but he is also not the leader, and neither is Jeremiah. So they must go back to Chicago and speak with Elijah Muhammad about what to do about this. They can't make that decision. And Elijah Muhammad has a different take on this. Elijah Muhammad has this nation, it's growing. He wants to grow more businesses in the South, and he knows how the plan works. He knows that you can't really do anything unless you have some kind of permission to not be harassed or to even conduct business down there as Black people. So he's saying, well, let's have a meeting, see what we can talk about, because I want to buy some more land. I want to set up a separate state. I want to buy farms. I want, so we can grow our own food and set up more businesses. And so Malcolm doesn't like this. This is what he calls it, an unholy alliance. And this is really kind of what the first rift between him and Elijah Muhammad is. It comes up here. And Malcolm does go forth with the meeting because he wants to at least have an impact. He doesn't want the nation to come out short-handed from this meeting. But, Elijah Muhammad understands that Malcolm is so disgusted with this that, he tells him, don't, you won't be a part of any further negotiations. And he leaves Jeremiah Shabazz in charge of that. But the chapter itself, and just understanding, you get to really hear how the Klans people talk, and the language that Malcolm used, how he can be cunning and doing his wordplay, but also holding the position, and so that does he maintain his position in this meeting. And it's very cleverly done. It's a side of Malcolm that you really kind of get to see in action, and it's riveting. It's riveting writing, but it's riveting action. And then just to say also, the setup here is to kind of understand what's going on here, is that why would the Klan want to meet with the Nation of Islam? The Klan wants to uphold segregation. They see Martin Luther King and the civil rights leaders who are making headway. They've already had success with the bus boycotts, and they're overturning the superstructure of white supremacy slowly. And they are threatened by this, and they want to stop this. So they're looking at maybe having an alliance with the Nation of Islam to use them against Martin Luther King and the other civil rights leaders. So that's kind of what we're looking at with the different forces down there. But Malcolm, he really doesn't want anything to do that, and nor does Elijah Muhammad want to be used against other Black people in that way.
That's really very vivid, but I just remember Jeremiah's wife having to serve them like pastries and cookies in her apron, and it's this Klan, and it is just so unreal. Like you're worried they'll be killed. I mean, it's really outstanding. We won't have time today to discuss the assassination chapters, and there's so much in them. And I think the listeners today will have to go to them. Are you okay then at 6:45 if we go? Do you want to say anything more before we go to questions from the audience? Because there's so much in the book we won't get to.
Right. Well, I will just say this about the assassination chapters. I mean, I feel when asked about them, there's so much work and research that went into that, to researching and discovering the stories that we do tell in the assassination chapters. I feel that whenever I talk about it, it minimizes the work that goes into it. So I really would encourage people to go to the book and read them for themselves.
I think that's a really good answer. I've been told, Tammy, to pick out some of the, we have a siren in the background.
Yeah, it's over. It's me.
We'll get over it. Anyway, we have a lot of questions, but let me start with the first one. One person wants to know, what do you think Malcolm's position would be on the current political situation, the resurgence of white supremacy, etc.?
I would argue, he would be upset. He would not, he would not be okay with it. But I would argue that we probably wouldn't be in the situation we're in right now had he lived. And it's part of the reason why people, Hoover and others, really had an interest in having him taken out. But he would not be happy with it, but he would also be organized. He would be supportive of the Black Lives Matter. He would be organizing to looking into how authority is being used against the Black communities. But he will also, and I think about today, when we talked about the pandemic and how it has affected our communities, and he would be really heavy onto that and looking into strategizing and organizing to making sure that people are having ways to combat that in the communities. So and of course, I think that he'd be part of the defund the police movement. So I mean, it's he would definitely be organized, and he would definitely be encouraged by what he sees happening with Black Lives Matter. But he would also be working with them to have strategies. But I also would hope that we would have had more strategies, and that's why I'm glad we have this book here, that people can really look at Malcolm, revisit his speeches, revisit what he was saying, and his life and where he was coming from, and to develop their own strategies of how to go forward with the situation that we're in.
Tammy, I think there's a lot. I agree with you there. Let's go to another question, which deals with something we really didn't cover. I think the man who asked is John Reeves. He says the book includes a lot of detail on the assassination of Malcolm X, including on the killers and what they did immediately before, during, and after the attack. It is absolutely riveting, but many of these details were new to me anyway. How did you and your father uncover these details?
Sourcing. I mean, looking for people who are willing to talk about what was going on, and finding them and getting them to talk. I mean, this is the work of what journalism is. It's not easy. But Dad was tenacious on this. I mean, he would not, if you're going to tell the story of Malcolm, it was very important to find out as much as we can about what happened. Where did the the call, who gave permission to actually have this even go down? And then, how was it orchestrated? What was the culture like? It's important that we find out we have these details.
Can you give examples of anything that might be new in this version that hasn't appeared before in terms of the last few chapters on the assassination?
Well, I think the questioner explained that the details of what was going on with the killers before, during, and after, for example. We also bring you into the Autobahn where, we have, how people are scattering. Where do people go? That Malcolm was given a gun by somebody who was on his security detail the night before. These types of details are important to understand, what Malcolm was up against and what he was dealing with during that time and before he left the planet.
Another question here. You had to make a lot of decisions as you finished the book your father worked on, but you weren't able to ask your dad for his opinion. How hard was that, and how did you solve this challenge?
That was not as hard as I thought it would be, actually, because my father and I worked really closely on this book for 28 years. And so we talked about how this book was going to play out. We, especially in the end, we were very, close, almost on a full-time basis in the last 2 years of his life. We were really working on this book to bring it to a close. And so I knew what he wanted and where he wanted this to go. And so I would have to say it's difficult because it was, I lost my dad, and that was upsetting to me. But I also had to make sure, and I was determined to make sure that this book sees the light of day it has, and I'm glad it has. And I wanted to make sure that my father's voice was protected and rings throughout the book, and it does. And that was what my focus was. But knowing that I had those conversations with my dad, I knew what he wanted, and I knew what we wanted as a team.
You don't think if he had lived that he would have just sort of continued to do interviews and not finish the book? You think he was able to stop doing the interviews? I mean, his interviews are just
Well, it depends
heroic.
on how interesting the person was. If they
Right.
brought in
See,
something
I
that
think there's a possibility that he would still be doing
I
interviews.
mean, you know, there's always somebody. The thing is, somebody is always bringing in interesting details, and you want to see how does this change the story, or is it helping the story? Does it enhance the story? So,
I mean, anyone who reads his book as just, I mean, the editor, I was just stunned by the firsthand research. It's just the amount of investigative reporting is really remarkable. Another question. I'm curious, I'm curious about your experience of completing the biography. Did you make discoveries for yourself about biographical writing? And after this experience, do you think you might go on to write another biography someday or soon? I believe this is from Susan Bernofsky, who is a very talented translator. I think this is she.
I don't know about how soon I would go into writing a biography. It depends. I mean, I just find the whole process of writing and putting together this book in particular, but writing a book and completing a book, the whole process I have, you know, a real respect for, and I appreciate it. And I do want to write other books. You know, I'm not sure if I want to do a biography. We'll see. There are a lot of stories that need to be told, and I definitely am interested in exploring those.
Here's another one where we might have touched on it, but you can elaborate on it. This is from David Greenberg. I have not read the book yet. I'm eager to do so. How do you think the book revises popular or scholarly perceptions of Malcolm? What elements of his life or thought do you think have not received enough attention or study?
Well, I think that starting off with the book, before, you know, the publishing and the writing of it, but early on, I mean, one conversation we would always have is that Malcolm has always kind of been presented to us fully formed and angry, and not enough information was given about where he was coming from, and even placing him in the situations he was in. And so this book does that. It places him in American history, but it also places him directly, you know, the culture of the Nation of Islam, the culture of New York and Harlem, the culture of New York and Harlem as a teenager, finding his way as a hustle, you know, hustling through the days,
Tammy,
working on the railroad. It puts him in context, and that's important.
can I brag about the Harlem chapters? We speak about immediacy. You are on that, you know, on the trains with him, just his charm and hustling people. I mean, it is just, he comes to life. I mean, he's outrageously charming. I mean, he's a bad boy then. And it's just, I mean, you know, can you mention, like, did your dad ever speak to Red Fox, or is that just, you know?
No, he did not speak to John Sam, but Red Fox did write a biography, and he did, we quote from it. And
Explain the connection. Explain the connection of Malcolm to Red Fox.
All right, so Red Fox was a comedian that we all know from Sanford and Son and other shows. But he really kind of came on scene for me in the 70s through the Sanford and Son. But he was a comedian, and but he ran into Malcolm, you know, in the early 40s here in Harlem, and you know, and they were working at Jimmy's Chicken Shack, which actually is not far from where I live, and the addresses, and they actually worked in the kitchen. They were dishwashers. And Red Fox, you know, Malcolm writes about Red Fox being very funny, and Red Fox writes about Malcolm. He said he was really bright and he was entertaining, but you know, he was into hustling. He says, but Red Fox himself was very committed to his craft of entertaining, and particularly being a comedian. So he knew what Malcolm was, you know, into. He said, I wouldn't hang out with him all the time, but he was, you know, we were friends and we were friendly. And we even have a picture of Red Fox visiting Malcolm at the Harlem restaurant that the Nation of Islam owns. And it's just a beautiful picture. It's like they're reunited, but they did know each other earlier on. And so.
I don't know how much you can answer this, but first of all, here's a great compliment. It's an extraordinary book. The research, I do appreciate the footnotes. Some of the story takes place in the upper Midwest, where I come from, so I paid close attention to the family's relocation to Omaha, a moment in Milwaukee, Lansing. Now, this is, as I read about Malcolm in the early 60s, the image of Che Guevara flashed through my mind. Is it simply they are both iconic and therefore a superficial association, or is there a moment in which they move in parallel? I don't know if that your experience, Che Guevara, but that's a question.
I really, I wouldn't be able to really speak to that.
Okay, here's a question where I've picked this up. As an early childhood director in a diverse school where many educators are still fearful of Malcolm X, how would you suggest speaking on Malcolm X in these most necessary times? And let me add something. I gave the book to a friend of mine who works at Chase Bank, a wonderful friend, and he says, why are people still slightly scared of Malcolm X? And I mean, I think there's this perception we have to overcome, and maybe you can explain it.
Well, I think there is a perception. I think first of all, it's miseducation, it's ignorance and misinformation has been put out there about Malcolm. And as I said, that we try by putting Malcolm into this context. I mean, a lot of people are looking at Malcolm differently now. Malcolm would often say that when the media, talks about us, and he accused the media of doing this with him, they would isolate him and take him out of the context of the work that he was trying to do. For example, the struggle for civil rights and human rights of Black people in this country, and they isolate him from that. And they just take his speech and they isolate the speech, but they don't put in the context of what he's speaking to and what he's trying to do in educating people about what is going on, which are things that the news media was not necessarily fairly reporting on. So we need to understand that this is happening even right now. We're dealing with this and the consequences of that. So we need to understand that that is a factual thing that continues to happen. Understand it. There are so many things in our history that we don't have all the information on. We need to come out of our holes and really look into it. This book, I would say, have people read it. Have teachers read this. Have teachers assign this book in high school and in college to read this book along with the autobiography and to get another look at who Malcolm was and what he represents and what he was doing and understand the context. And here's an opportunity to do that. And we just have to take that opportunity to do this, to educate ourselves. I mean, Malcolm once said that the reason why racism, succeeds in this country is because of greed and ignorance. And he said that if white people understood the contribution of the Black man to civilization, development of civilization, mathematics and science, he'd have a different perspective and idea about Black people. And Black people, if they understood their contributions more fully in society and in sciences and mathematics, they too would see themselves differently and also would act even more humane and be, act like humans with human beings. But you have to do that only through gaining information, accepting and embracing information. Can you do that?
Tammy, we are at the end, and just this affirmation of Malcolm X. First of all, I apologize to the many questions that we couldn't get to. I'm very sorry, but this affirmation of who Malcolm was, and also an affirmation of your dad, and also your heroic ability to finish this book, I think comes across very clearly in this hour-long interview. So I don't know if you have anything in parting words.
Just I encourage people to read the book. And for those of you who have read the book, I thank you. And I hope that you will share the information that you learned from this book and share and talk about this with your friends and family and students.
Well, thank you, Tammy. Thank you to the Leon Levy Center. Thank you to the entire audience of 279 people. And again, congratulations, Tammy, on winning the National Book Award. And it is an extraordinary achievement, which I think will always change your life as well.
Yeah, and it's bittersweet because I do wish that my father was here too, to have received that honor. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.